The first essay, The Necessity of Chivalry, was my pick, and I want to explain and justify why. I asked Elisa to discuss that essay together with a beautiful essay talking about bicycles. Both of them come from the same period of the Second World War. So, The Necessity of Chivalry was published in a newspaper called Time and Tide. It was published in 1940. And what is very interesting about both of these essays, because talking about bicycle is after the war, 1946, but it was written in 1945, about this time, is that these come from the periodicals. So these are not books that basically were either, like Lewis was not asked to write about them. For example, The Problem of Pain, he was asked to write that book. But these were periodical articles. They're really short, as you can see. They have been collected into this brilliant book. It's called Present Concerns. And I advise everybody to get this tiny, slim book because it's full of gems. A lot of times when we think about articles, like in newspapers or popular magazines, we think about maybe like more, I would say like things that have passing value. Do you understand? They would expire, their currency would go away, they would be of lesser interest. Well, Lewis is unique in this case. His small pieces, short prose, right, that he wrote for periodicals, is practically timeless. And they provide oftentimes very valuable keys to his larger works. For example, The Necessity of Chivalry helps me a lot to understand and appreciate that hideous strength, the last in the Space Trilogy. But let me speak briefly about the period in which these texts were written. First of all, the Second World War, but primarily 1930s, 1940s. Is a unique period when Lewis expands his audience dramatically. You probably all know that he not converted, actually, he was baptized as a child, he was raised in a Christian Anglican household, but he gave up on faith. He was almost a happy atheist and materialist in his youth, until he, at Oxford, begins to rediscover Christianity, or maybe discover it for the first time, because he says, yes, I have learned a lot about doctrine as a child, but it didn't touch me. It did not, in some sense, shape and form him as much. So, in 1931, Lewis begins to attend regularly services at the Holy Trinity Church, Anglican Church, in his neighborhood. He basically just walks to it. And he starts taking communion. And I do see in his biography, like studying his works and reading, almost all everything he wrote, I'm a big fan of Lewis, that he has changed profoundly. From youth, from almost childhood, he dreamed about becoming not just a poet, but a great poet, or one of the greatest poets. And up to this period, he has 2 books of poetry, which did have very modest, quiet praise of critics, but they have almost no popularity. They didn't sell well, they were practically unknown. He also is a brilliant scholar. He has wonderful books on the history of literature, especially like Renaissance period. He read everything. When he wrote his academic pieces, he's first rate. And as a lecturer at Oxford, he's also very popular. But he doesn't breach out at all. And then as soon as he starts attending church, it's as if he quite literally dies to his own interests and concerns and begins to discover the concerns of his society, of his culture, of his period. And he starts writing very different type of prose, of course under the influence of many friends and the Inklings, right, and other people who influence him. But he begins to put out enormous amount of texts at this period. Let me just mention that it is this time during the Second World War that he's asked not only to write theological works like The Problem of Pain, he is also asked by BBC to give a series of lectures on Christianity. And they were astonishingly popular. They were later collected into the Mere Christianity. After this, he begins to also develop kind of like a persona of public speaker. For example, you may have heard of The Weight of Glory. Maybe some of you have heard of it. Well, it's one of the most brilliant sermons. It was delivered at Oxford Church. I think Mary the Holy Virgin or something like that, I forgot. But it's like he's also delivering something that maybe not many people are aware of. For example, the inner ring. It's one of those gems, again, that are so worthy of reading, but not many people really know about this. This was a graduation speech at the London University, 1944. But let's look at just the other types of like fictional output. Some works are started or even finished during this period. The famous Screwtape Letters, the Screwtape Letters, his space trilogy, right? Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength, which I have with me today. Also, The Great Divorce. And, you know, this period is almost like blossoming into a very different persona. It's almost like the third Lewis is born. Not just the Lewis, the great, sensitive, and profound critic, not a poet Lewis, which was his dream, which he says he failed utterly at, by the way. He himself writes in letters about this. But a person who is a commentator, who is a profound sort of sage, I would say, who evaluates where his society is moving to, what direction it's taking. So let's talk about The Necessity of Chivalry. It's a very simple piece. I'll summarize it very briefly for you, but the one thing that really is repeated over and over again is how chivalry, and think about it, this is a medieval concept, right? This is about the values of the elite of the Christian Europe. But he says the following: it is, he says, it's terribly relevant for the modern world. It's one of the world's hope, right? Any lasting happiness and dignity depends on restoring the ideal of chivalry. And you might say, in what sense? How is chivalry relevant for post-war, or it's actually in the post-war, 1940, he's writing at the time when the Battle of Britain is just beginning, and the war is becoming very serious for Great Britain. So why chivalry? He says, chivalric ideal, he obviously starts with Lancelot as being one of the, well, pronounced the greatest of knights, is not a natural phenomenon. Chivalry is a phenomenon not of nature but of art, he says, because it combines things that are never naturally gravitate toward each other: ferocity and meekness, ability to fight and humble demure. He basically says a knight in the Christian medieval European tradition is a combination of features that you don't find naturally together, so they have to be cultivated. But why, for example, he even says that, for example, Achilles does not display the kind of urbanity, meekness, and gentleness that Lancelot, for example, who is meek and whole, meek with the ladies, displayed. Why is this ideal even important? Well, he's talking about what Britain is going through. He's talking about how in the society that has been cynical about such values as valor, honor, for so many decades, it is a danger that you would not find people who will be able to defend society well and at the same time be, humble, meek, and not destructive and violent. Violent in the sense of violent to their own, sort of like the friends and the people who are to be protected. So he's mentioning the young pilots of RAF, Royal Air Force. And he says that's hope. This is a glimmer of hope that some of these are still around, that these knightly chivalric values are not entirely extinct. But in some sense, you might say, but why does he end his essay by saying, and it's pretty grim warning, he says, the ideal embodied in Lancelot is escapism, in a sense never dreamed of by those who use that word. It offers the only possible escape from a world divided between wolves who do not understand and sheep who cannot defend the things which make life desirable. And of course, with this ending, you might say, oh, so his message is about political development. And in this regard, we immediately recall, and you probably haven't read this, but Plato's Republic, Book 2, speaks about the philosophical dogs. So, and I do have a quote here from, like Socrates says to Glaucon, well, our guardians who are responsible for protecting the polis, right, the ideal state, they have to be gentle to their familia, like the citizens, right, of the polis, and very ferocious toward the enemies. And so if you look, for example, in Book 2, Socrates says, you might be perplexed. How do we find such a thing? Where do we find a person who combines ferocity and humility in a harmonious way? And of course, Socrates answers Glaucon, who is doubtful about the possibility of this ideal, and it is a chivalric ideal that Lewis is talking about, by saying, our friend the dog is a very good example. You know that well-bred dogs are perfectly gentle to their familiars and acquaintances, and the reverse to strangers. And then Socrates continues, then there is nothing impossible or out of the order of nature in our finding a guardian who has a similar combination of qualities. What is Lewis talking about? He's talking about how the elites of the past lived by such standards and values as valor, honor, and self-control. Because in the democratic society, these values have been cynically reassessed as purely inflated or exaggerated or unrealistic, this kind of idealism came under severe criticism. And because of that, Lewis is worried that the society will devolve into completely controlling, or kind of like he calls them conditioners in an Abolition of Man, these kind of the group of leaders who are immoral, unprincipled, unconcerned, and the population who also is kind of degenerate, and the sheep, right, that he talks about. And these wolves sheep, it actually is something he uses in several essays of his. So this necessity of chivalry is in fact contains a very profound message, and it's a message of political and cultural relevance. So I think I'm going to stop here, and we will talk about the bicycles. Right?
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for that, Dr. Corwin. And maybe we can even circle back to Lewis's own life in the way that he has gone through what I'm about to talk about, the 4 stages of enchantment. The end of this essay, in some ways, picks up on the beginning of the importance or the necessity of chivalry, how to have the right approach to an ideal without being disillusioned when we fall short of that ideal, both in politics and in our own lives. So, talking about bicycles, what is this essay about? There is a conversation being had between 2 men in a bar. And I will say, just in terms of the nature of dialogue, already we can see that Lewis is wanting us to enter into this conversation. A dialogue lends itself to dialectic, to seeing where we might disagree with someone else, realizing our shortcomings, and then spiraling up toward the truth, right, through this kind of back and forth conversation. And so that's, in miniature, what is had here. So, one of the friends begins. Talking about bicycles, said my friend, I have been through the 4 ages. I can remember a time in early childhood when a bicycle meant nothing to me. It was just part of the huge, meaningless background of grown-up gadgets against which life went on. Then came a time when to have a bicycle and to have learned to ride it and to be at last spinning along on one's own early in the morning under trees in and out of the shadows was like entering paradise. That apparently effortless and frictionless gliding, more like swimming than any other motion, but really most like the discovery of a fifth element that seemed to have solved the secret of life. Now one would begin to be happy, but of course I soon reached the third period, pedaling to and fro from school. It was one of those journeys that feel uphill both ways, in all weathers, soon revealed the pros of cycling. The bicycle itself became to me what an oar is to a galley slave. But what of the fourth age? I asked. I am in it now, or rather, I am frequently in it. I have had to go back to cycling lately now, and there's no car, and the jobs I use it for are often dull enough. But again and again, the mere fact of riding brings back a delicious whiff of memory. I recover the feelings of the second age. What's more, I see how true they were, how philosophical even. For it really is a remarkable, pleasant motion, to be sure. It is not a recipe for happiness, as I then thought. In that sense, the second age was a mirage, but a mirage of something. Jumping down to the bottom of that left column on page 3, he defines these 4 ages. The bicycle is only one instance of these 4 ages that he's about to talk about. I think there are these 4 ages about nearly everything. Let's give them names. They are the unenchanted age, the enchanted age, the disenchanted age, and the re-enchanted age. As a little child, I was unenchanted about bicycles. Then when I first learned how to ride, I was enchanted. By 16, I was disenchanted, and now I am re-enchanted. Okay, what is this all about? I think I first gravitated to this essay because I'm often thinking about pedagogy and teaching, thinking about the ways that we can enchant our students to love or to see perhaps something that we ourselves have seen. And I think it's important from a pedagogical standpoint to think about what age you all might be in when it comes to education, your own life, the church. One, I think, quality of maturity that Lewis, I think, is pointing to here is that when we begin to love anything, we begin to enter upon these 4 stages: unenchantment, enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment. And that in some ways it becomes a serious mistake of judgment when we jump ship because we've entered disenchantment. And we think all of a sudden, you know what, the great books, they were great when I was a freshman. Seminar conversation, then you get into sophomore year, junior year, now you're beginning to get disenchanted, right? Because that one person in class just, bombards the whole conversation, and this one professor, I actually disagree with him more than I realized I did. And, you start beginning to see the underbelly of these things that you were so taken up by. And you commit the kind of, I suppose, error of judgment to think that that's a problem with education. Instead, I think what Lewis wants to point us to is, no, this is the natural course of coming to love and know anything, right? And you begin to realize that, yes, we do have to have ideals. We do have to strive for something like chivalry. But what do we do when we realize that we fall short of the ideal? Do we become disenchanted and then cynical, which is to say we despair of all possibility? Or do we perhaps attempt to look at the thing again from a new angle? There's this great moment in Tolkien's, I think it's Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, where he's recounting actually a story by that Chesterton recounts in his biography of Dickens. This is how I came to know this story, of Dickens sitting in a room, and he's sipping on a cup of coffee, and he looks outside the door, and he sees written on the glass, More Epoch. And he thinks, where am I? And he has this very jarring moment of just being completely discombobulated. So he gets up, he walks out of the room, and he reads what this word actually says: coffee room. He's been there before, every day for the past several months. But he had this moment, this experience of seeing this thing from a new angle. And now Chesterton comes to coin this phenomena, this morifach, right, as seeing something that has become dull and boring anew because you've seen it again from a new angle. That's re-enchantment, right? So how do we begin to, first of all, become enchanted with something, fall in love with something, then to perhaps reconcile ourselves with the way in which this ideal has fallen short, and then to continue to love it, right, in a way that is not naive, but accepts its failures. And this is what Lewis says when we apply these 4 ages in the experience of love. And I think that this is a really helpful way of thinking about this, because part of this dialogue is wondering, well, when I first loved this thing, when I first loved this person, when I first loved my education, when I first attempted chivalry, was that wrong? Was I naive? Right? Is this just a kind of a trick, a mirage of my experience? And his friend says the following. Okay, so this is on page 3 in regard to love. So he asks his friend, we can apply these 4 ages to love. His friend says, oh, I've never been married. His reply, oh, that's a pity. For in that case, you can't possibly understand this particular form of re-enchantment. How do you become re-enchanted with a person that you've become seemingly disillusioned with, right? You're in your 15th year of marriage, right? You've been through all the ups and downs that experience, right, that great adventure brings. And now you have to think about how do I become enchanted again without being naive to this person's faults. I don't think I could explain to a bachelor how there comes a time when you look back on that first mirage, perfectly well aware that it was a mirage, and yet seeing all the things that have come out of it, things the boy and girl could never have dreamed of, and feeling also that to remember it is, in a sense, to bring it back in reality, so that under all the other experiences, it is still there, like a shell lying at the bottom of a clear, deep pool, and that nothing would have happened at all without it, so that even where it was least true, it was telling you important truths in the only form you would then understand. But I see I am boring you, is what this man says. Okay, so how do we look back on our experiences, perhaps experienced in naivete, and appreciate perhaps the idealism, the romance of the thing, without reducing its nature. This is, I will say, why I love teaching freshmen, right? Because you are in the enchanted age. And I think, the more and more that I teach, there's a temptation towards cynicism, a temptation to come across maybe one too many students that simply doesn't care, or one too many professors that has also given up on the project of education, or to come up against my own shortcomings, right? The ways in which I fail, and don't know and have to relearn the things that I teach over and over again. So that temptation is always there. But if I can maybe experience again, right, this first love of philosophy, of education, which you all remind me of, I can then move from disenchantment to re-enchantment, right? And the ages all help each other in this movement. So this is somewhat general overview. There's a lot of very good other examples here, and he ends with a consideration of politics, because this has an obvious application here. So maybe, Dr. Corwin, if you wanted to jump in.
And reading that politics part.
The politics part, yes. So he says toward the end, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we better get moving along. That man over on the other side of the bar thinks we've been talking about politics. I'm not sure that we haven't, said I. You're quite right. You mean that aristocracy is one other example. It was the merest enchantment to suppose that any human beings trusted with uncontrolled powers over their fellows would not use it for exploitation, or even to suppose that their own standards of honor, valor, and elegance, for which alone they existed, would not soon degenerate into flash vulgarity. Hence, rightly and inevitably, the disenchantment, the age of revolutions. But the question on which all hangs is whether we can go on to re-enchantment. What would this be? The realization that the thing of which aristocracy was a mirage is a vital necessity. If you like, that aristocracy was right. It was only the aristocrats who were wrong. Or, putting it another way, that a society which becomes democratic in ethos as well as in constitution is doomed, and not much loss either. So, yeah, there is this kind of final appeal maybe to some of the political ideals I think that chivalry points to. So did you want to pick up on that point?
Yes, and what I really appreciate about is the question of how do we reach re-enchantment. I almost would like to, and I suggested to Elisa that we can call this kind of comparative reading of two essays the necessity of re-enchantment, because even though Lewis sees that there's a necessity, there's a need and a reality that all of us go through these stages. Especially, he focuses on the transitions from unenchantment to enchantment, from enchantment to disenchantment. But in some sense, he does see these stages of our desire, because that's all about desire, really, as necessary. But what he also underscores is that we should never be stuck in any one of them, except for re-enchantment. Because re-enchantment, it's almost as if, think about, for example, the theological concept of innocence, fall, and restoration. In many ways, the final stage is the stage of eternity, of basically arriving, of destination. Other stages, although they're also indispensable, although we might question whether fall can be called happy, but ever. But in many ways, he says, it's really arriving at re-enchantment that is most significant, and not being stuck in any of the preceding stages. And when he talks about politics, it especially just astonishes me how he sensed the dangers of his society, the society of post-war, or, it's literally like Second World War, but also post-war society. When he talks about the necessity to restore aristocratic values, he sees that they will never be any more connected to any specific class. And he doesn't even advocate like restoring the class of aristocracy. He basically speaks about cultivation of heroic virtue in the populace, in people who willingly and individually really embrace heroic virtues and do not succumb to the trends, the pressures, the influences of the society in which they live. For example, in The Necessity of Chivalry, he says the following: "Now it seems the people must either be chivalrous on its own resources, or else choose between the two remaining alternatives of brutality and softness. This is, indeed, part of the general problem of a classless society, which is too seldom mentioned. Will its ethos be a synthesis of what was best in all the classes, or a mere pool with the sediment of all and the virtues of none? But that is too large of a subject." And then he says at the end, he says, it's basically, my theme is chivalry. "I have tried to show that this old tradition is practical and vital. The ideal embodied in Lancelot's is escapism in the best sense of that word." And I have already read that passage. So why cultivate virtue, heroic virtue, even when society doesn't seem to encourage it? In what sense do we re-embrace idealism without its dangers, without the dangers of being blinded, right, to our own shortcomings and maybe society's shortcomings? How do we, in fact, re-embrace idealism without being victims of it, like in some sense disoriented, misguided by it? It almost reminds me always of Don Quixote, like how do we, in fact, preserve the heroic virtue without really tilting at windmills and trying to find imaginary giants and all of the things. So, in my opinion, he does give an answer, and it's in the bicycle essay that he says the most important thing that helps you to reach re-enchantment after disillusionment, because he says you can't jump from enchantment to re-enchantment, right? You have to go through the disillusionment stage. But the way he says it can be done is to realize that in the object of your pursuit, in the object of your desire, you can never have eternal happiness and satisfaction. But it doesn't make your desire improper or false. You shouldn't stop desiring beauty, goodness, and truth, even if you don't find them right away in your immediate surroundings. He says that you have to go beyond the disappointment, as Elisa said, beyond the disenchantment and disillusionment, to realizing that if you have that desire, that longing, he calls it by German word Sehnsucht. It's this unidentifiable, almost like, in some sense, like unlocatable longing and desire. For what? He says, for something. Well, I would rephrase it, for someone, because Lewis, at this point, fully realizes that genuine, real happiness can only be found in him, in God, right? In the transcendent. So this is why he says re-enchantment is a work of not only maintaining heroic values and heroic virtues, but also maintaining, most importantly, such virtues as hope and faith.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really helpful way of thinking about this. These virtues, I think, are very important as an antidote to the problem of despair and of cynicism. I think I was thinking a little bit about this first essay and paradox, and we talked a little bit about this beforehand. Chesterton, in Orthodoxy and in many other places, introduces the problem of paradox as a kind of, or the idea of paradox as a kind of solution and a key to understanding all of reality. And it comes after a discussion of the failures of rationalism. Paradox, in a way, presents life to us with its real complexity. And we sometimes want to soften the extremes of reality. We think it's not possible to both be meek and courageous or bold. So we just go for something soft in the middle, right? And Chesterton says that the church in particular abhors this middle ground. It has a perennial disgust for the color pink. It loves red and it loves white. But this middle ground, it abhors. And why do we choose the middle ground? Why do we say that, we choose something between optimism and pessimism? We choose something between these extremes of, what are the extremes of chivalry here? Modesty, ferocity, and meekness. Exactly. We choose one or the other, right? Because we are trying to fit reality into our mind, right? And what happens, Chesterton says, when we do that? Our mind explodes, right? It can't be done. And so, and I appreciate what you said earlier about this being somewhat a key to many of Lewis's works. I thought particularly of Aslan, when Lucy is talking to the beaver and asks if Aslan is safe. And their reply is, no, he's not, but he's good, right? Which is to say, he's not safe. It's not to say that he's safe in a particular context, and, if you're friends with Aslan, they have nothing to worry about. No, you have something to worry about. The gospel recently was about, in liturgy, one of many possessions, right, that Christ exercises. And this man who is possessed by legion, he says, confronts Christ. And what does he say immediately? Jesus, Son of God, what have you to do with me? I beg you, do not torment me. And it's a wild thing to say to Christ, right? The tormentor, right? The terror of demons. He is that, but he is also merciful, and he is also good. And so there's something about, I think, that, especially post-Revelation, right? We can now see that paradox in some ways describes all of reality, right? That Christ's incarnation, the hypostatic union, the joining of man and God actually informs everything we see, right? And to settle for one extreme over the other is to not get reality right. And either we become optimists or we become pessimists. We think that, the ideal is easy to achieve, right? There's all this hope and possibility because we're naive. Or we become pessimists because we've despaired of the ideal, right? We have no solution. We have no way of reconciling these extremes in our small rational mind, right? So we become cynical. So how do we get out of that?
The dangers of lukewarmness.
Yes.
But how do you stay both warm, like hot and cold?
Right.
How can you be gentle and ferocious? And Lewis says it's practically never going to happen by accident. It's just something that you have to be a committed. Basically, like in a committed effort, you have to cultivate and maintain it continuously without ever giving up. In some sense, this is the struggle. That's the Christian warfare. This is the struggle of maintaining hope in a world that seems to be getting darker by the minute. And by the way, as I said, the essay on chivalry is actually a very wonderful, small key to many of Lewis's works. And one of the works that I really read through chivalry, The Necessity of Chivalry, the essay, the small article, is that hideous strength. And of course, some of you may not be familiar because the Space Trilogy gets different reviews. A lot of people say that aesthetically it's not sort of like the high literature level, but at the same time, it is incredibly helpful nonetheless to experience Lewis as a fiction writer. He never was very proud of himself. He was extremely humble. He actually, on his deathbed, he said, I forgot to whom, but he says, well, after 5 years, nothing that I have written will be read by anybody. Oh, how wrong was he? Like it's a profound misunderstanding of his in output, right, and his influence on people. But that hideous strength is a novel. Like, let me just sum it up. Like I wrote, it's a dramatization of what. The Necessity of Chivalry presents in the philosophical terms. So philosophically, we go back to Plato, we go back to the guardians and the aristocratic values. What happens in that hideous strength is that it basically really begins with introduction, with a very exposition, almost in some sense like exposure of the antagonists, the evil ones, the wicked wolves, the ferocious people. They're called the Nice Institute. The irony is here, like the abbreviation. The Nice Institute is National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. And this is a combination of political force, wealth, and science. Immoral science. Science that actually practices experiments outside of any moral concerns. So it's about manipulation of population, experiments on nature. Quite literally, one of the moments I absolutely love it. One of the Nice Institute members wants to exterminate all trees because they're messy and just replace them with artificial replicas made of metal. So, like, you kind of see that, like, Lewis is being ironic here, but it's getting dark. By the middle of the book, this Nice Institute and all of its machinations and workings are becoming practically satanic and demonic, and what they represent is the fierce, ferocious, power-hungry elite that is unconcerned about anybody or anything, and it's kind of getting deranged. Like practically, if you look at the members of the Nice Institute, almost all of them are deluded or downright just pathological. the psychopaths or sociopaths as well. But who is the soft sheep? Who are the meek ones? Well, there is a character who succumbs to the temptation of getting into the inner ring of power in this nice institute, Studdock. So Mark Studdock. He is the soft intelligentsia. He's an intellectual who sells out, basically. And Lewis says that the problem with Studdock is that he has given up on the traditional high values of honor, dignity, valor, right, strength. He's actually like a very problematic masculine figure. He has troubled marriage where he practically is a failure of a man. And he represents him as such. I don't want to give you the whole, the content of the book, but gradually Studdock is led out of this sort of disaster into which he was very much pulled, right? He was literally absorbed by the Nice Institute precisely because he lacked valor, courage, strength, right? That sort of the traditional heroic chivalric values. And I think that Lewis at this point in his life, he's very concerned that the society is basically becoming split into controllers or conditioners, as he calls them, in an abolition of man, and people who are sheep, right, who literally, they're anxious, they're powerless, they're toothless, they themselves are utterly dependent, irresponsible, they do not cultivate in themselves the aristocratic values of responsible, free, and courageous, brave living. And in some sense, that's why the end of the bicycle essay, it's almost like conspiratorial. It's like we've been talking about politics right here. What is Lewis talking about? Preserving these heroic traditional values on our own. Oh yeah, we're left on our own. We cannot rely on institutions to help us. Yes, classical education is one of the ways to resist, but it cannot happen only through institutions. It has to happen at home. It has to be embraced by parents. It has to be embraced by individuals, right? So in many ways, this is a plan of resisting the trend that's very dangerous, says Lewis. I think he was 100% right about it.
Thank you for that. I will go ahead and close this out. I wish we had more time. We've started a little bit late, so I'll just maybe say that, maybe emphasizing something you mentioned earlier, Dr. Corwin, about that chivalry is not of nature but of art. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting thing to think of. And if we can just hold out for 1 second here. He says in the bicycle essay that what we have to particularly be on guard against is the danger to think that this age of unenchanted man is actually a disenchanted man, which is to say, I think there's a way in which we fear trying anything because of the cynicism we hear about it. Or perhaps we've been disenchanted in other realms of life, so we choose to simply choose, we choose the way of soft virtue, right? And this is the problem that Tocqueville points out, with aristocracy and democracy, that in a democracy, there's a way in which all virtues are accessible to man, but they are not typically chosen because they're not expedient. They don't immediately satisfy. And so this, in some ways, seems to be Lewis's concern, that we are dealing with a mass population of unenchanted man. And this word enchantment, I think, is important. He doesn't say cynicism. He doesn't say disillusionment. He says enchantment, right? To be taken up into something, to be cast, to have a spell cast upon you, right? To be taken up in song, to be within the song.
Surprised by joy.
Surprised by joy. Yes, I thought of that as well, right? It's St. Francis coming out of the cave, as Chesterton says, as if walking on his hands, seeing the whole world turn upside down, right? All of the trees all of a sudden look like they're being held by something. He says, I immediately thought dependency, right? That, in some ways, there's a religious quality to re-enchantment. It's a transcendent quality, and this is why I think Lewis, says that chivalry is an art. We can't reason our way to these things. We can't reason these extremes together so that they are more palatable to us. We have to embrace something that it transcends them, right? This is Kierkegaard's religious sphere, right? To move beyond our own minds, right? This metanoia. So can it be done? Well, we'll have to see how the next 3 years go for you all. But I have hope. So, all right, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Corwin.